No, umeishika hiyo. Please remember to give me back my program. I've been told and I've been warned that you run away with the program.
I don't need to go around doing it really made a difference. I think it's on that. And just that.
And it's very good to do the role play because you all feel so, and you ask 57 either you, then you lay, you know, I feel the way to come. So how long are you staying for?
Very but I think
What? Yeah, we are okay. Yeah, I double checked. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, I'm standing in the way of my life.
Well, a very warm welcome to everybody. I hope you all had a restful night. I hope the debate continued way after the drinks. And it's really great to have you all in. So yesterday we had a fantastic day. We had a great talk from Professor Abigas giving us a whole detailed history of how the journey Africa has taken has led us to where we are in terms of the political, economic, and social transitions that have set the stage for the higher education landscape that we are in at the moment. We had loads of conversations amongst ourselves, an interesting interlude there at some point. And generally, we really did set the stage for the conversations that we will have today. Some of us discovered alternative careers in acting, and some of us let our inner Trump come out, which was scary to see. and I'm really glad that we all got a chance to also meet and interact with colleagues from across the university at the drinks reception. So today we have a fantastic day ahead of us. We're looking more to the present and seeing what are the big questions for research in Africa, what are the big questions for sustainable development in Africa, and how can we address these questions using interdisciplinary and collaborative approaches. So I'm really excited because we have a fantastic lineup of speakers set up. And before I invite the speakers for today, I want to just make a few notes to remind ourselves. So we have we have tea breaks and lunch breaks, and these are all for people to interact, get to know each other. So I hope you take the time today to talk to somebody you haven't talked to. Talk to somebody who's either not in your discipline or not in your institution, not an affiliate or not an Oxford person, and just break the ice and get to meet people from other places. This interdisciplinary research happens not because of projects or institutions, but because of people. It's because of the relationships that you build here and later on that are going to be the foundations on which you build your research. So please take your time and do that. And in that spirit, people working in agriculture and related fields, please meet Chris at the back there at lunch or during the tea breaks and have a conversation with him if you're in his area of expertise. You will learn a lot, trust me, I am learning a lot. So without taking a lot more of your time, I want to invite the first speaker. It's an absolute honor to invite Professor Sir Charles Godfrey. He is the director of the Oxford Martin School. He is an expert in food security. He looks at global food systems and how they need to adapt and change in the 21st century. It's a really honor because he's not only a great scholar, but a good friend of our folks. And so please join me in welcoming Sir Charles Godfrey.
Thank you so much, and it's an enormous pleasure to be here, particular pleasure to be here in the UK when the temperatures today are going to be the same as they are in Nairobi. So for our African friends visiting, it's like this in Oxford most days. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to speak for 24 minutes. Kevin has been extremely fierce about sticking to exactly 24 minutes, so I've got a stopwatch here. On some of the issues around feeding 10 billion people by mid-century, what we expect the population to be around about 10 billion by mid-century, and how we do it sustainably and equitably. And I guess to sort of give, to frame this somewhat, my disciplinary background is as a population biologist. And the sort of person who started our field of population biology, one of the founders of economics as well, was Thomas Malthus, who was a rather upper-class English clergyman working in the late 18th century. And Malthus is famous for a number of things, but he was famous for a prediction he got absolutely wrong. And this was that, actually, I do apologise, there's a typo there, that should be late 18th century, late 19th century. In the late 18th century, he predicted that there would be famine that would go throughout Europe. He was very much just a European perspective there, a famine that would decimate Europe in the beginning of the 19th century. And he famously said that food production increased arithmetically, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, whereas population increased geometrically, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and then my maths runs out. And Malthus was wrong. He was wrong because of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution had very many complicated effects. It allowed greater productivity, and it also led to a readjustment of labour. Labour was taken off the land, which led to stimulus for greater agricultural productivity. And he was also wrong because excess populations emigrated to other countries. And so we got the beginning of the age of colonialism. But that is what I'll call the first of 3 waves of Malthusian pessimisms, time when we have become very worried about food supply. But anyway, food to a certain extent, at least in the rich world, went off the political agenda for 150 years after Malthus. And it came back on the agenda in the 1960s. And I'm just old enough to remember this in the 60s and early 70s. And this was the time of Paul Ehrlich's population bomb, the Club of Rome. And it was again a time when there was apocalyptic worries about population outpacing food supply. And I reread Paul Ehrlich's Population Bomb recently, and it's one of the books that influenced me most when I was in my teens. I was amazed reading back on it by how authoritarian it was and what it declared must be done to control populations. And Ehrlich predicted that there would no longer be democracy in Europe by the end of the 20th century. I worry slightly it might have been out by 15 years, 20 years, but we won't go there for the moment. Anyway, this second wave of Malthusian pessimism was incorrect because of the Green Revolution, the extraordinary advances that occurred in plant breeding that allowed exceptional yields to be increased in an exceptional way. And there's been a third wave of Malthusian pessimism, and this has really happened in the last 10 years. It's abated somewhat, but in particular in 2008 and 2010, these are the FAO Food Price Index. I give both nominal and deflated. We're always told to use deflated, but they're deflated using US inflation targets, and there is evidence that this actually underestimates the effect. If you use dollar deflation, then you underestimate the effect of food price volatility of people in least developed countries. So the real effect of food prices is somewhere in between. But however, there was a tremendous amount of volatility there. And this has brought food security back onto the agenda in a way that I think is wholly good. And I'm not going to try and summarize all the issues around food security that exist today. Here are a couple of, a slide which sort of just talks about some of them. We have continuing demand growth. Population is increasing, although the good news is at a decelerating rate. But people are becoming richer, which is excellent news. We want people to come out of poverty, but as people come out of poverty, they want diets that take more resources to produce. If I have time, I'll come back to this right at the end. But I think one of the trends that, especially those of you who are based in Africa, won't need telling, but I think us in Europe need to be reminded, is the massive rise of urbanization in megacities, which I think is disrupting the way we think about food security, and that we're not catching up with the reality there. We have hunger and undernutrition. Now, there's been tremendous progress on hunger. One of the few Millennium Development Goals were met was in the reduction of hunger, largely because of what happened in China. But there is positive news on hunger and undernutrition, though tremendously more needs to be done. I guess one of the things that has sort of reared up and bit us, and even 20 or 30 years ago people hadn't predicted this, is the rise in obesity. Beginning in the rich world, now moving into middle-income countries, and increasingly in the middle classes in least developed countries. I'm going to be talking quite a bit later on about some of the health consequences of this, but this is a real issue. And we have countries, for example, like Mexico, which was making tremendous progress on getting rid of diet-related deaths associated with food. But now these are increasing, and they're not because of undernutrition, they're because of overnutrition, typically in the middle classes, which ironically is sucking health system resources away from the systems that have been allocated to help poorer people. Pressures on agriculture, water scarcity. Water again is probably the thing we're going to see first, and competition for land and soil degradation. So again, you know all these things. This is my one slide where I sort of do a litany of gloom. And then I also worry about the resilience to shocks, climate change obviously, but also human shocks, the way that we can disrupt the system. And again, I'm going to come back to that at the end. So that's a sort of framing of what I'm going to talk about. And in most of the talk, what I'd like to do is to describe some modelling that an interdisciplinary group of us at Oxford, linked with the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, one of the CG system based in Washington, who run a partial equilibrium model of the food system, some investigations that we've been doing about what may happen in the future in the food system. And hopefully this will prompt some discussion and questions. This slide, which I'm not really going to go into, this is the equivalent of the sort of the small print when one gets a sort of financial documents and things. But this sort of describes a little bit about the underlying mechanics of the models that I'm going to develop. I mean, basically, it is driven by some external exogenous factors, emissions, climate models, population scenarios, and socioeconomic scenarios. These are taken from some of the standard OECD scenarios going ahead and some of the standard IPCC scenarios. And then the guts of the model is a crop model and a water use model, so we can try and take climates and predict what effect that will have on food supply. We run it through an economic model, and we think this is important because if you produce more of one food, then its price goes down, and the consequence that has for the makeup of a diet is really important. So the combination of the production model with the economic model, that can predict people's diets, and from that we can look at health outcomes, and we're lucky in Oxford about having a really good epidemiological group here, so we've put in the best we know at the moment about how different diets affect diet-related health outcomes. And we're interested in environmental outcomes. Now, the only environmental outcome I'm going to be talking about today is greenhouse gases, because that's relatively easy. If you produce a molecule of carbon dioxide in Oxford, it's essentially the same as if you produce a molecule of carbon dioxide in Accra. So it's relatively easy to deal with. We will be looking at some others. And then we are sort of dipping our toe in trying to look at some of the economic consequences. So I'm happy to talk more about that, but I am going to ask you to largely take on trust what the underlying models. I should say, I'd like you to take it on trust that we've done it sensibly, but I'd sort of enjoin you not to believe a word that I say. I mean, the function of models, at least I think in this sphere, is not to make predictions in the future, but it's to sort of work your way through the logic. I mean, these are complex, non-linear, quantitative things. The English or any other language is just not up to arguing it through. So all the modelling is a way to carry on the conversation when verbal language runs out. And to me, the role of the modelling is almost as much to help one try to understand one's assumptions and how they interact than to try and make predictions into the future. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask 3 questions and then look to the model to try and answer them. And the first is, what if we eat healthily? And so what we did is we assumed that by 2050, everyone in the world is eating the type of diets recommended by the World Health Organization. Now, of course, this isn't going to happen, but we think it sort of bounds reality going ahead. And we hope we've done this in a relatively sensible way. So we've not assumed that diets in Tokyo and Dar es Salaam and Edinburgh are going to be identical. They'll be far less healthy in Edinburgh, of course. So we're assuming that it moves to balanced diets, but in the locally appropriate way. And then we calculate diet-related disease deaths, we look at the greenhouse gas emissions, and we begin to explore economics. And I'm going to show a couple of maps like this. You'll see that now in the UK with our curious political situation as well at the moment. we have to take a new map that the Foreign Office has provided. You can see the position of the UK has moved somewhat. Anyway, we decided to be rebellious, and we are putting the UK back to where we think it should be. So what we've done is we've gone through and we have calculated the avoided deaths if we switch to this, to the WHO recommended diets. And the darker green colours are where there are more avoided deaths. And we were quite surprised when we did this, because actually there are more avoided deaths in the rich world, in China and Russia and North America, than there are actually in Africa. And this is beginning to show the burden of overnutrition on diets and things. So yes, if everyone in Africa was eating the type of diet recommended by the WHO, there will be less mortality. But actually, some of the biggest wins will be got in the rich world from this. Now, I think this slightly exaggerates for two reasons. First of all, this is deaths, not DALYs. So many of the deaths due to overconsumption are people late in life rather than early in life. And it also doesn't look at the effects of micronutrients and things. But it is beginning to say just how important obesity is. Here is the effect on greenhouse gases. So we're going to have to reverse our greenhouse gas, thanks so much, our greenhouse gas emissions. And food is one of the hardest things to do. But if we switch to a good diet and do nothing else, none of the adaptation, none of the mitigation, then we can knock the expected increase in greenhouse gas emissions from the food system from 51% down to 7%. Now that's nowhere near enough, but it helps along the way. But I think this also says something interesting. The orange colours there are where greenhouse gas emissions need to go up per capita. And this has to go up in Africa. And the reason for that, and a few other countries as well, is the reason for that is to get a good diet in Africa, then this will unavoidably lead to more greenhouse gas emissions. And the message for this is surely that the rich world has to do more on bearing down on its own greenhouse gas emissions so that the developing world can catch up and enjoy the lifestyles that we do over here. Here is, I'm going to say very briefly about this, an estimate to try and look at the economic costs. And I won't go into the complexities here, but on the left are two graphs where we do the social cost of carbon and then the direct and indirect costs associated with the diet-related deaths. And you can see that those are big numbers on the right there. If GDP for the whole world is 80 trillion US per year, then we're getting to sort of coming up to about 1% there. And then, and this is where, and you can see some economists in the room, if you use some of the sort of hedonic measures, how much would you pay for an extra 5 years' life? Then you're getting to figures there which are coming up to 10%. I don't believe them, but they do illustrate some of the economic benefits. The second question I'm going to ask is, how will climate change affect diet-related mortality by 2050? And so we essentially we run two scenarios, one with and without climate change. And again, just to anchor this, at the moment the WHO, a death-based estimate, suggested that there might be 85,000 deaths due to climate change and diet. Now the good news is that business as normal, we expect there to be 2 million fewer deaths per year associated with diets. And that's largely because over the next 30 years, we expect populations to become wealthier. If you factor in climate change, then that goes down to 1.5 million. So whereas the WHO estimated figure about 85,000, we think it is nearer 500,000, the avoided deaths, that climate change, that won't happen because climate change will affect the food system. We can use the model to explore what makes up that 500,000, that 500,000. And climate change will have both positive and negative effects on diet-related deaths. Above the line are the negative effects. And we find that the two major negative effects is, first of all, people will be eating fewer fruit and vegetable, largely because climate change will affect fruit and vegetable. Fruit and vegetable will become more expensive, and there'll be less fruit and vegetable in diets. And also, because food is more expensive and poor people will not be able to get good enough diets, there will be more people in the underweight category. And this will be counterbalanced somewhat by below the line, less consumption in red meat because it's more expensive, and fewer people entering overweight and obese classes, again because food is more expensive. This suggests where the climate-related deaths per million people will be distributed throughout the globe. I'm running a bit short of time, so I think I should probably go on to my last question, which is what if we tax climate-unfriendly food? And what we did there is we did something, at least initially rather boneheaded. We just put a tax on food everywhere on Earth, depending on greenhouse gas emissions. And when you do that, you get changes in price, that's the blue histograms above the line, which affects consumption, the red histogram below the line. And you see that in particular beef, plant oils, milk, lamb, we eat less of it than that. So what is the consequence of putting on this tax? Well, first of all, if you do this, you get some health co-benefits. So you actually get 100,000 avoided deaths per year. And you get a real greenhouse gas benefit as well. You have 1 gigaton of carbon dioxide emission reduction per year. And that's actually round about 10% of what we need to do to keep the diets below 2 degrees. So this simple consumption tax, which I realise is an academic thing to explore, but again, we're sort of putting boundaries around the policy sphere, has a really major effect. But look about where the avoided deaths per million people are. And this is completely unacceptable. Yes, there are avoided deaths in high and medium income countries, but those bright colours, the red, is more people dying in Africa, largely because that tax has made food more expensive. Now, of course, what we can then do is to be a little bit less boneheaded and say, well, let's tailor the tax for the different areas. And in particular, you could just not have it in below a income threshold. And so, look, at the moment, we have 100k avoided deaths and 1 gigaton carbon dioxide saved. And if one does that, then one can get rid of that horrible increase in mortality there. And actually what happens is you get more avoided deaths by doing that, because you're not penalising people in the poor world by making food more expensive. And yes, there's a little bit more reduction, but it really is at the margin. So again, this is, I'm not trying to argue that this is a sensible thing to do or that you should believe it, but it's a way of exploring the policy base. At the moment, fiscal interventions in the food system are hugely problematic. My guess, my prediction, is in 20 years' time, they will be far more socially acceptable. So in the last couple of minutes, I just want to end with one particular thing. I guess in general, I'm an optimist for the food system looking ahead. In the medium to long term, I worry about events in the short term. This is a percentage income spent on food and alcohol. If you look, there we are, UK, USA, we spend 8 to 9% of our income on alcohol, on food. Probably at no time since money was invented has society spent less on food. But then as you go up, there's some African countries at the top, then more and more of our income is spent on food. I keep meaning to replace this and get rid of the alcohol, because people just look at the alcohol things, sort of things, feel proud about the UK. We drink more than France. And what's happening is Hungary there. Surely it should be called thirsty, not hungry. So for a large fraction of the world, a lot of their income is spent on food. The second thing, and this refers to something that I said earlier, is that increasing fraction of the world's population now lives in cities. It'll be 2/3 by mid-centuries. And this is what you know so well, that there has been this massive rise of urbanization in Africa, something that I suspect that many of my colleagues who don't travel in Africa just don't realise in the UK. A final statistic is cereal trade in developing countries. And so if you take developing countries, and especially the poorest countries, then yes, there are some who are able to export grain, but there is a vast amount of grain exported into imported into developing countries, and especially into Africa, and especially cities on the coast. So if you're in Lagos, if you're in Dar and Kinshasa, it is actually easier to buy grain on international commodity markets than it is to get grain from indigenous agriculture, which is poorly invested in and is poorly linked by infrastructure. Now, it is clearly a priority to stimulate agriculture in these countries, but for the next couple of decades, they will depend on being able to access relatively cheap food and global commodity markets. This is a graph I showed you earlier of the FAO Food Price Index, and if we look at focus in on that area of volatility, and this is some work put together by a group in Boston University in New York, you can see that during that period of volatility, it was associated with civil disturbances in all sorts of countries. The Madagascan government, I think it's there, I can't see Madagascar, that fell at the time, a number of other countries. It was associated with the Arab Spring. My worry is that we are not doing the type of resilience test on the global commodity system that I think everyone wishes one had done with the banking system in the early 2000s. I worry that a confluence of droughts, perhaps a war, could lead to an area of to a period of volatility such as that, in which these big megacities in the global south are going to find it very hard to be able to import food cheaply. And of course, urban cities, when there is problems with lack of food, then people are on the streets, and it's very, very visible, very fast. So I guess that's the thing that sort of worries me. And we in a privileged position in Europe, we cannot isolate ourselves. It's all of our joint problems. And certainly if you look in Europe at the tragedies that have been playing out in our television screens with people dying as they try and get into Europe, that would be as nothing if we got wrong the stability of the global commodity system and its ability to feed big urban megacities. So to finish, this is a really interesting time to think about food security and food systems. I hope in the modelling that I've convinced you that there's some interventions that have both health and environment and indeed economic co-benefits. Just the point I made right at the end, I think we should think seriously about the resilience of the global food system. I worry about that a lot. And then, you know, whatever we care about, my background, as I said, as a population biologist, I care deeply about biodiversity. Many of you will care deeply about other things. But essentially, whatever we care about, if we get food wrong, then it's game over. If we fail on food, we fail on everything. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Charles. If we fail on food, we fail on everything, right? Thank you for setting the stage, because our next speaker is actually going to be talking about urban health. And from the cities and the stories of urbanization that we've been told, I guess I'm looking to some encouragement. So join me in welcoming Dr. Tolu Oni, who is a public health scientist. There are many accolades today, so let me get this right. Public health physician scientist and urban epidemiologist. So quite a mouthful there. But if you know Tolu, if you've been to any international conference, you've probably ran with Tolu in the morning. So it's a great honor to see a public health specialist doing it in action. So please join me in welcoming Tolu. And as Tolu comes in, let me quickly note that we will have a 1 hour session of question and answer, moderated panel, talking about all these things and thinking about them holistically. So please write your questions down, hold them to your heart, and we will come back to all of them later, all right? Okay. Good morning, everyone. Great. So I'm going to focus on urban health. Oh no, this is yes. But in particular, I will focus more on the approaches and how I got to where I am in terms of my research focus. Thank you. I understand not everyone is necessarily interested in this topic, but obviously we're here talking about interdisciplinary approaches to address the SDGs. So I will focus on a little bit of my research journey in how I think about the research I do, how it affects the SDGs and how it affects urban health more broadly. I'm feeling incredibly short for this. Yeah, please. So I started off in clinical medicine. Thank you. Yes, I can move. I started off in clinical medicine, and dealing with the individual level, and you see something wrong, you try to fix it. Worked in internal medicine and kind of HIV, and I thought, well, some of my public health trainings, like, how can we actually stop people from coming in the first place? What is it that causes some types of people more than others to get sick? So actually my move to research started looking at how do we start to address some of these issues. By the way, if you're interested in the topic, then read the slides, and if not, listen to me. So I will be speaking differently to what is on the screen. Okay, so where I am now actually started, I initially started on infectious diseases, so looking at HIV, TB, trying to understand, so I was working in South Africa, looking at, trying to understand the burden, trying to understand the determinants and the kind of patterns of how these diseases co-occur. And I started noticing that, okay, we're very focused on improving our HIV outcomes. We understand that HIV and TB coexist. But I started noticing that people weren't just, the patients didn't get the memo. They didn't get the memo that they were supposed to be just HIV, TB and nothing else. So I started noticing that, people were coming in with hypertension, with diabetes, but because there was HIV, TB, and that was the research I was doing, you focus on that. So we started treating essentially disease outcomes and not the people, not health. So we anecdotally started seeing in the clinic, people who have had, after a period of not having access to antiretroviral therapy, being very well controlled, suppressed viral loads, but dying prematurely of strokes and uncontrolled hypertension. I'm thinking, well, are we treating diseases, or are we treating people? And how can we actually start moving from thinking about being disease-focused? Okay, some people need to stay on the diseases, don't get me wrong, but individually thinking, well, how can I start moving from being so disease-focused to actually stepping back and focusing on health? So I started thinking a little bit more about what was going on in the population. So it's not my work, but just to show South Africa's, the example of South Africa, to understand how the pattern of disease changed over time. So thinking about, so the red, essentially, don't worry about the letters. The red is infectious, the blue is non-communicable, the green is injuries and violence. Above the zero line is increasing, below the zero line is decreasing. So without looking at any of what the text shows, you start seeing that, yes, we still see this huge hump of HIV between 1990 and 2010. Some reduction in, so these are disability-adjusted life years, in diarrhea, in low respiratory, but a lot of what we were seeing going up was blue, right? So we started seeing a lot of diabetes, a lot more, hypertension-related health outcomes. So I started thinking, well, maybe I want to look at how those interact. So I started then looking at the interaction between infectious and non-communicable diseases, diseases that both coexist and interact. I'm not presenting any of those data. Suffice to say, moving on from that, I started noticing that, yes, they co-interact, but what is it that is driving this change and this pattern that we're seeing? So I was working in a city largely, and I thank the previous speaker for highlighting the urbanization as an important issue globally, but particularly on the continent. So working in Kailicha, if anyone knows, Cape Town, Kailicha is kind of the largest settlement of mixed formality, if you like, it's about 500,000 people. So I started kind of just seeing, well, what kinds of things were in the environment that people were coming in, and still at this point, still very much within the clinic and seeing what people were coming in with. Just outside, just at the doorstep of the clinic, what kinds of food are available, what are the kinds of spaces for physical activity, etc. So in what we see in across the African continent is a rise in urbanization that we're seeing. In fact, in a lot of cities, so while we talk about cities and talk about urbanization, it's important to highlight that this is not necessarily the textbook urbanization, that over almost 2/3 of the urbanization we're seeing across the continent are largely into conditions of informality. And pushed by growth of populations, and that's both intra-urban and rural-urban migration. So I started thinking about the cities not just as these buildings of different structures, but started thinking more about cities as okay, I didn't segue myself well enough. I started thinking about cities more as exposure. So this is from an epidemiological perspective. How can we break down cities instead of just thinking about the building, thinking about what are the exposures within the city that are driving ill health? Realizing that what we see within the health sector is at this, really at this, the peak of the iceberg. What we see is the manifestation of ill health in terms of the health profile, in terms of healthcare, but that below this, a lot of the things driving the ill health are things around education, things around housing, things around your food environment, and that may be quantity, but also quality of the food you have access to, your socioeconomic issues, and importantly to note that the majority of this is outside the health sector, which is very uncomfortable for a physician, because we think we're the ones that do health, right? Put another way, thinking about the drivers of ill health beyond the individual, to think about these different levels. So this is what is termed as the ecological model, thinking about not just the individual, but the community level and the policy level environments that drive the determinants of disease. I'll take a step back. We're here talking about the SDGs. So I've mentioned the SDGs for the record. So one of the great things I think about the SDGs, I mean, there's been a lot of critiques. The funniest I've heard is no target left behind, because there's so many. But I think one of the great things is that it forces us to think about the different components. So moving from just being something that's relevant to development, people who are working in development, but really breaking down what development means. And I dare anyone to not recognize what they do in one of the 17 SDGs or one of the 171 targets. But my main critique, if you like, of this is that it puts the 17 goals as very discrete goals, whereas actually, in actual fact, we know that they interact. I like this adaptation, because it puts health at the center, by the WHO, that really, for example, shows the different ways that the SDG 3 interacts with all the other SDGs. So looking at particular aspects of the different SDGs and how they actually interact with human health and well-being. I also like the work by what was then called the International Council of Science, starting to dig a little bit deeper at some of the interactions, and I would encourage anyone thinking about that to look at that report. Is available online. I pulled out the example of SDG 3 and 11. 11 is around sustainable human settlements, where you essentially highlight and look at the targets and the different ways that they interact, but more importantly, what kind of evidence we have around how they interact and what the gaps are and what the policy options are. Because these systems interact,
It's important that we think about not just one particular SDG, but the intended and unintended consequences of the interactions between the work that we do and how we could potentially impact and co-benefit, if you like, on other SDGs. So moving a little bit beyond SDGs into broadly into the global policy area around the human settlements. I didn't put the logo around the habitat. So the Habitat 3 is another important, I think, global policy agenda around looking at human settlements, looking at the ways in which we can promote and develop human settlements sustainably, and that interacts with the SDGs, so that's something to highlight if anyone's looking in that area. Also in terms of the Agenda 2063, which is an important AU document that I think we should all be familiar with, highlights sustainable, healthy human settlements as an important priority for the African continent by 2063. So again, when we're talking about global policy agendas, yes, SDG, but also look at the different ways that they interact, partly because the countries that we work in are working to these policy targets. So going back to my thought process, I started thinking about then these urban spaces, and how can we think about them not as buildings but as exposures. Now, please excuse the somewhat contrived S's, because once I started I had about 3 or 4 S's and then all of them had to be S's. Because then I could call them the S's. But thinking about discrete components of the urban environment and how the ways that they interact and drive ill health. So for example, sugar, salt, sort of to highlight particularly important components of the food environment. So the excessive refined sugar that we consume, and salt obviously related to hypertension. Sex, because it's still driving, and the vulnerabilities associated with that, the HIV burden, substance abuse, smoke, air pollution, and smoking, sleep and stress and noise pollution associated with high blood pressure and cardiovascular disease, sanitation, water, safe housing, social cohesion, mental well-being, sports and recreation in terms of physical activity, looking at obesity, looking at hypertension and cardiovascular disease. So this is oversimplified, but really trying to pull out some of the things. And if you remember nothing else, remember that when you think about cities, don't think about the buildings and the shiny buildings or the squatter camps, but think about them in exposures and how they impact on health. So I started thinking, so at this point I was working the outcast in a TB research group, doing stuff on TB and NCDs, and then I decided to, oh sorry, you can't really see it, but I started asking, the red text reads, can urban exposure be harnessed to positively influence health? Because we know that they could negatively influence health, but can we harness this urban exposure? Because this is where we know most people are. And if yes, how and by whom? And the second question is particularly important because when we think about health, we think, or if I ask you, who is responsible for your health, we think about a healthcare professional. Do you think about the health of the government, but you think about the Department of Health within the government? But do you think about the mayor of your city? Do you think about the person responsible for urban planning as being responsible for your health? And how can we start thinking about the ways that we need to create health? How can we take a step back, not necessarily focus just on disease, because particularly on the African context, I don't think we can afford to think about treating ourselves out of these epidemics, because we can't afford to. So we need to start thinking more innovatively about how to create health and not just address disease. So I set up this research group and kind of moved into the School of Public Health within UCT, the Research Initiative for Cities, Health and Equity, RISH, I like my acronyms, you can tell. To really look at, some of these key issues, really, as I said, the 3 key issues, looking at cities and health determinants, looking at understanding that these issues that drive ill health are multi-causal, and really taking that socio-ecological model, looking at the different ways to address ill health, not just at the individual level. So the two aspects of health systems, which is a little bit more familiar, looking from within the health sector, what are the different ways that the health system can be more responsive to changing patterns of disease that we're seeing. So focusing on HIV and NCDs, focus on adolescents, because we never think about adolescents when we think about NCD risk prevention, but that's when a lot of the behaviors that determine NCDs start. We avoid them because they're complicated. And more recently looking at systems for health. So moving from just thinking about health systems as something within the health sector, but how can we think about the systems that are required to create health? So for example, looking at the food systems and the food system governance when we think about NCD prevention. Started some work now in my new position in Cambridge across a few countries on the continent and the African continent, looking at urban levers to improve adolescent diet and physical activity. So how can we better understand how the exposures of the different population groups to those urban determinants in order to better understand how to intervene. And lastly, health and housing policy projects, and this came about, just speaking about interdisciplinary research now. The one thing I didn't realize when I started this was how ill-prepared I was for this kind of research. I'd done epidemiology and very classical epidemiology for the longest while before that. And realizing that if I was going to do research into understanding how best to change the urban governance model and actually insert health into non-health sectors, for example housing, I would need to firstly understand what the policy landscape outside of health was. Right, because I knew the NCD, the strategy for NCD, South African strategy for NCD, and the targets there. But I had no sense of what the human settlements people were doing. I had no sense of what the transport and people were doing. And we tend to operate on a deficit model where we then, because we don't know, then no one's doing it. It's not true, as it turns out. So what I did was, essentially, so I realized I didn't know. So I started reading around it, and I organized a workshop where just invited policymakers from different sectors just to come have a chat. So we had people, surprisingly, people came, sure, but people from housing, people from education, people from Department of the Premier, people from transport, people from public works came, people from health obviously came. And some of it was just to say, well, what are the policy priorities in these different sectors? What are you working on at the moment? And what are the opportunities for working together to create co-benefits for health? Understanding that the people in the room were more responsible for health than I was, okay? The lowest hanging fruit was housing. They bit, so in the tea time, just speaking about the importance of tea time conversations. In the tea break, it was just a half-day workshop. In the tea break, I got talking to the director for policy research within Department of Human Settlements. And she says, we know that what we do impacts on people's health and well-being. This is not, the great thing about public health is not rocket science. But our priority areas and our performance indicators are really just around putting structures up and in place. So we just don't have time to think about this. But we'd potentially be interested. There's my in. Everyone else go home. So then we spent the next year and a bit trying to raise money to do this kind of work, because then, you know how it goes. But essentially we developed a proposal around looking at understanding, just from the policymaker's perspective at different sectors, what are the understanding, what are the knowledge, what are the perspectives around the role of what they do in health. And this was not just limited to health and housing, but across some of those sectors that I mentioned. And thinking about housing, by the way, not just thinking about the physical structure, but also the psychosocial, cultural home environments, the physical patterns of the neighborhood and the social environment. We realized there was very little data in the context of informality, which is something that we have to deal with, cannot ignore. So this was the work that we set up to do, essentially looking at how to mitigate health risks of inadequate housing in a real in a real situation, not just hypothetically. So focusing on the human settlements policies and the existing governance structures. We interviewed the combination of, as mixed methods, a combination of the kind of classical epidemiology, understanding the barriers, enablers, determinants of intersectoral collaboration between the sectors, but also a lot of more qualitative, which is something I had to learn, of understanding what the perspectives are. But also looking at where data sits in these different sectors. So this didn't really come out, don't worry about it. So one of the things that we found was that, firstly, in fact, I think I will move to, I know there's a lot here, I'll move to this bit. One of the things that we found is that people were open to engaging and thinking about the way that what they do impacts health. But there were different groups of people. Some people were very much like, this is what we do, that's all there is. And some people within the same sectors had a much more intersectoral approach. One of the critical factors that was identified as a need was the absence of intersectoral data, i.e. absence of kind of a spatial data that you could bring together between, say, the health and other sectors to essentially facilitate measuring the health impact of some of the interventions in these urban environments. The responsibility was the other thing. We're doing this, we're not doing, Department of Health has all the budget anyway, we're not going to do their work for them, unquote. So the collective responsibility for health creation. So how can we think through, and that relates to the incentives and drivers for urban governance, to be honest. I don't think it's malintent. So how can we think about accountability for population health beyond the health sector? Some of the opportunities to bridge, one of the things that we identified was actually, so in the South African and Western Cape context, there was a lot of, actually surprisingly, policy and strategy documents about bringing sectors together to work towards not just health, but employment, towards youth development, but the implementation was lacking. And why was that? So there were obvious opportunities for intersectoral collaboration, which is why I was hopeful. Very little consultation with the community, by the way. So just to conclude this, and I just wanted to give you a sense, more focus on the process. If anyone's interested in this, I'm happy to talk more in the tea break. But essentially we found that was understanding that health is critical to development, and the majority of the factors that influence health are outside the health sector, that the urbanization plays an important role. We also started to understand that such approaches will require coordination between the health and non-health sectors to ensure healthy public policies, as opposed to just health policies. That we need new forms of intersectoral dialogue and data sharing, and that capacities need to be built to implement these intersectoral health creating interventions. So just FYI, before I just go to the last bit of the talk, so the next stage we're actually looking at some spatial epidemiology, looking at 4 key pilot sites. So because we've been engaging with the human settlements area, we'd identified areas that they had prioritized for urban upgrading. So they collected some data from a human settlements perspective. So we've been working now with the Department of Health to essentially integrate the health data and spatially overlay the health data on those areas to collect some baseline information on how they overlap, in order to then be able to track over time the health impact of the interventions in the built environment. So I can talk a little bit more about that later. But I want to spend the last 5 minutes or so talking about some of them, just from reflections on interdisciplinary science, right? Because this is why we're here, because I see my role in giving this talk, and not just to talk to you about urban health, but the approach to interdisciplinary science, so that you can see how it applies in your perspective. As was mentioned earlier, I am a runner. I don't know if you picked that up. So a lot of my personal lessons, to be honest, come from running. So I will excuse all the running metaphors that are about to come through. But I've reflected on some of the lessons that I've learned for interdisciplinary science that are important, and they just happen to work with running. The first is around embracing uncertainty. I think there's a lot, we have so focused on certain, okay, this is my career path, this is what I do, I started with this question, this is where I go, oh, but this is really interesting for impact, no, but I don't know what, Embrace that uncertainty, because I think that question, that lingering question in your search for impactful research is something that you need to embrace as you run off into the distance, misty distance. But there's not guaranteed success. So the story with this is that shortly after this, I had a colossal fall and broke a finger. But then 2 weeks later, I had a race, and then I did it with a cast on. So fail fast and fail with confidence and get back up, because that's because of things that you learn along the way. And the great thing was, because that race was on the mountain, and that little cast I could use to hook to climb. So it was actually, it really helped that run. So you never learn, you never know. So I think that's really important to think about. There are going to be trade-offs and benefits when you're thinking about this kind of interdisciplinary science. But it's important that you understand what those are. But importantly, think about you and your strategies for resilience and well-being. Because if you're embracing this uncertainty and embracing this spaces that are not necessarily familiar, look after yourself. Find your community. I'm really glad you're all here, and I'm cognizant that in the afternoon you're going to be talking about what the affiliate program means to you, but the importance of finding your community and finding those partnerships that will help you, firstly, assure you that you're not necessarily lost the plot for doing what you want to do, because finding people who are as committed to impactful research and thinking about things differently is really good for your mental well-being. Atypical partnerships, we had this really long 5-day race, and I ended up meeting this, Klaus is his name, he started running when he was 60, and we started running together, and we entered this race together, this 5-day race. We did really well. Everyone laughed at us because, we're kind of an atypical partnership, but it worked, right? So the importance of, don't think about, they're the obvious partnerships that you find, but often when you're asking new questions, you need to think about and embrace those partnerships, and really the community, again, I can't highlight the importance enough of that. Pivot and question. Sometimes what I tried to incorporate into my talk was thinking about, well, I wouldn't have thought this was where my research would end up now, given where I started. But I followed the question and what I wanted to do. I had a bit of a crisis of research, and I thought, well, am I just doing research for the sake of research, or didn't I do research in order to impact population health? But in order to do that, I feel like I want to go this way, but there's no one else here, and there's no funding here either. But pivot. And if there's no funding, question it. So we wrote a paper saying, you need to stop penalizing researchers for trying new paths, right? So we wrote about it. So follow the question, and don't be scared to question often. Know and navigate your landscape. So this is a euphemism for science on one side and policy on the other side, and trying to really navigate that and really understand, because how many of, we're talking about SDGs, how many of us know what the country that you work's in national implementation strategy is for the SDGs that are relevant to your research? What? Right, but if you don't know what you don't assume that your country is not doing anything. You can question the efficacy of the implementation, but know that that is where their efforts are. So if you don't understand, do you know where the country presents? There's an annual presentation of the voluntary presentation on the country's implementation of particular SDGs at the UN. Do you know what your country has done? If you don't know, you go try and engage with policymakers on your topic, and it's a total disconnect. So really understand the landscape that you're trying to impact on. Just a couple more slides. Keep an eye out for the next unexpected ladder. Look for atypical opportunities, because you never know, okay? Coherence and convergence, just so that you don't pull yourself so many different ways. I started doing this running whilst I was traveling because I realized I needed running to travel. I needed running for my mental well-being, but I was traveling a lot and it was impacting. So I tried to do that whilst I was traveling. So look at how you can pull things together so that you're not pulling yourself apart. And I think lastly, embrace serendipity and the path less trodden. Somebody asked yesterday, but there are 40 people here from Oxford, how we know who is here and how we're not going to be able to speak to all of them. Do you need to speak to all of them? Speak to the person that's in front of you. You don't know who they are. Just because they're in engineering and not necessarily in your field, you don't know what comes behind them. You don't know what something you will mention about the kind of research that you do that will ring a bell and that will come back to them in another point and connect you. Okay, time is up. And the last point is learn and use new skills. Somebody mentioned in the lightning round yesterday about the kind of things that they want to think about or the skills they want to learn as part of an affiliate. These are just some of the opportunities I want to highlight that are relevant pretty much to all of you. Call for members for Global Young Academy is open. Global Young Academy members, raise your hands, please. Speak to one of them in the tea break. There's a registration still open for a science diplomacy course there. Africa Science Leadership Program, there's a call annually towards the end of the year, encourage you to apply. The Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Study has an early mid-career fellowship, which is fantastic. It's a 3-year fellowship that gives you 10-month residency. They buy out your teaching time to allow you to focus on your research. It's really, I had that, it was incredible. There's a survey going on at the moment, really trying to improve the state of young scientists, the research environment going on. So I encourage you to take that survey, whether you're in or of Africa, just to generate evidence to improve the state of research and scholarly environment for young scientists. So I think I want to leave it there. I started off in urban health, but I hope I've at least showed some of the way of thinking and the interdisciplinary approaches to get to addressing the SDGs, because it's not necessarily a very clear path. Thank you.
A round of applause for Tolu for teaching us not just about urban health, but also about life. And I hope we take these lessons to heart, because I'm also taking my notes on this. I think I'll start running as well. Wow. Our next speaker is an absolutely phenomenal friend. He's taken time off his holiday, off his sabbatical. He should probably be off in some beautiful island, but he's here with us. Professor Malcolm McCulloch is an energy expert, working a lot on sustainable energy, renewable energy, and also in the transport industry. People in Oxford will thank him soon when our electricity bills go down thanks to his research. So join me in welcoming Malcolm.
Right, let's see if we get the technology working. So, let's start with what you'll find is that I am the speaker, I won't be doing all the work. So the first question is, talk to the person next to you and say, what has this picture got to do with energy? Go, you got 20 of my seconds, so go for it.
I think it's biomass.
Right, here is a hint. There's a gentle hint. Okay, right, so let's, we'll come back to that later. Okay, because we're talking about SDGs, I want to talk a little bit about sustainability. I teach this course, and I find it's one of those, I call them weasel words, but it's a slippery word. It's a word that when I say sustainability, I have a concept in my mind, but everybody else has a different concept of what they mean by sustainability. And it's one of those really hard ones to get a grip on. And Brundtland had this, she and her group came up with this wonderful thing about saying it's, meeting the needs of today without compromising the needs of tomorrow. But the problem is whose needs, what do those needs look like? What tomorrow? Are we talking 2 years, 5 years? It's a really hard concept to work with. So what I try to do is, being a dumb engineer, I try and simplify things down about it. And I came actually to the concept around capital. And capital is the ability to do stuff. Okay, so it's not just financial, it's just any type of capital ability to do stuff. And I use the really simple one, which basically says we've got 3 types of capital. The first one is social capital or human capital. It's about people. The second one is environmental capital or the planetary capital, that's planet. And the third one is what you traditionally think about capital, which is money, which you could say profit or prosperity. Okay? So we think about these 3 as the core things that we can use to do stuff with. Actually, there's an odd one out. Guess which one's the odd one out? The odd one out is the middle one, as in profit. Because what actually happens is profit is used to transform environmental capital into social capital. And it's basically mainly following the red arrow. Now, when there was lots of planet and not very many of us, we could do that in a really dumb and stupid way, and it was okay. The problem is there's more of us, so we have to stop being dumb and start being a little bit smarter and start thinking about how do we increase the green arrow? How do we actually make the planetary system a bit better? Otherwise, we're going to bite ourselves. So this is kind of like my kind of view on to say, sustainability is basically saying, how do we increase all 3 capitals simultaneously? It's not that we trading off the expense of social capital with planetary capital. We're saying, how do we grow them together? And that's the hard bit, but that's the challenge that we have. So the 21st century challenge is to me, highlighted in this very nice little graph. Sorry about graphs, but anyway. On the bottom is basically the ecological footprint. It's the number of global hectares needed per person for that country to be able to sustain their particular lifestyle. It goes from around about 1 all the way up to 10 hectares per person in that country. And you can see where places like the USA, Trumpian land is up at about 8. You look at something like Benin, and it's below 1. Okay? On the vertical axis, so basically the horizontal axis tells you about the planetary capital that we're drawing on. The vertical axis is the Human Development Index, and I know the Human Development Index is crap, but it's what you've got data on, and it tells you what is the social capital of that place looking like. Okay? And again, we can see that we've got places like India or Benin, where it's pretty low on the Human Development Index, but it's low on the ecological footprint as well. And yet we can look and see that we go to like these countries up here, they got pretty good human development, the social capital is pretty good, but boy oh boy is the off-take quite good. And when I started looking at this graph and started teaching, in the 3rd year I suddenly realized, actually, if you look at 2 is if you take the total human population we've got and divide it by the land area that's available for ecological services, you get to about 2 hectares. So we've got to be below 2. 0.8 is a straw line. You can choose 0.7, you can choose 0.85, I don't care. But 0.8 is kind of like what the aspiration is for most countries to get towards. Okay, and what I came to realize is that this is the sustainability zone. That's where we need to be in. And you can see the vast number of countries that are there. Right? And so what I realized that the challenge for our century is to do that. Is that these guys have to maintain their social capital, but they've got to dramatically decrease their impact on the planet. Simultaneously, these countries have to improve their well-being, but without increasing the ecological footprint. And the insight to me that kind of jumped out to me is the destination is the same, but the journeys are different. And what I'm being finding is I'm actually working in both spaces, and what I'm actually finding is when I get a wonderful insight in this space, it directly translates here. Or, even more exciting, is actually the work that I'm doing now, which I'll show you about, which is definitely in this space, I'm now actually applying in that space. Because it both goes to the same area, the same target zone. And this is, to me, is why Paris has such a dichotomy of narratives. Because one narrative is about that, and another narrative is about this. But nobody's talking about, actually, that's the narrative. And so we can start to say, actually, we can join those two narratives to one. And that's kind of fun. Right, here's the next question. Who are these two people, and what quote did they share? Right, let's talk to your person next to you. You've got about 10 seconds, go. Hopefully you got at least one of those answers out. Okay, yes again, you're going to have to wait. Okay, I think I'll tell you one of those is Nelson Mandela. Right, so I was thinking, okay, so let's have a look at this to say, from my perspective, remember to talk about energy. What is a particular African challenge? Okay. Now, I work in energy. Now, to me, things like what Charles was talking about, food, and what Tula was talking about as health, are what I call essential SDGs. They have to happen. I talk about energy, and it's not essential, but it's a key enabler. Okay, so it's an enabling one. Now, for me, here's the interesting challenge. That's what the world looks like at night. Okay, in 2012. Talk to a person next to you. Okay, you got this is the last one you got. What's going to happen when I go to 2016? Okay, look how bright Africa is. Not. Okay, just watch. I'll give you a clue. Watch what happens to India. Okay, I'll go back again. So there's that. There's India. If you look at the Middle East, if you look at West Africa, if you look at the rest of Africa, has anything happened? Yes. A little bit. But is it anywhere near like the US or Europe or even China? Okay, so this tells this little picture is a kind of a visceral picture of what that graph was showing me. Okay, this is telling me, okay, we've got some challenges in here. Okay, and that's why we saw yesterday's group is to say, actually, it's that country there, you know, it's Africa's, as they start to lighten up, that's why they have a potential of producing a lot more CO2. Okay, so so how do we change that? So what are our typical options? So here's a typical one. This is Canberra. Some of you know Nairobi. This is Canberra. This is good old KPLC. Some of you hate KPLC. That's okay. It's a Kenya Light and Power Corporation. They like the Escoms of this world, but just in a different country. What they're doing is they're putting up poles in here, and it's costing them around about $800 per household. Okay. Now, the question is, how much energy do they actually use? So once they've done it here, there's been quite a lot of studies now to say how much energy do people use after 4 years? Okay? And the shocking number is about 15 kilowatt hours per month. Okay? So that's 15 kilowatt hours per month. That's about half a kilowatt hour a day. To give you an idea, US consumes about 30 kilowatt hours a day. Okay? And that's with people that are on grid, that's what their consumption is. Okay? So there's a challenge here. And the reason is because it's expensive. And the reason it's expensive is because you've got these traditional old ways of doing things. Because you remember, this kind of technology was developed in the 50s and 60s when you had lots of resources. And so resources were cheap and people were few. Now we're changing around a bit where that's flipping around. So the question is, how do we go around doing things? So here's just a quick kind of like family picture of the different options we've got. So here's a traditional way, good old coal-fired power stations with large transmission lines. So transmission lines get you over long distances, distribution lines get you over large areas, and that's the traditional grid, and that's the way that most countries are developed. What we're starting to see is actually we're getting rid of the transmission line, we're building the generation source locally, and we can start to do that. But the question is, if you have a look here, this is the distribution of a typical microgrid. It's the same technology, and it's still expensive. It's still that $300, $400 or $600 per household to do that. Then you go to the solar home system, where basically each person is their own generator. But the problem with that is that you only have one person using it. If they're not using it, what's happening to the energy? Nothing. It's just being wasted. So that means it's expensive. Okay, and that's why solar home systems, that even though they're quite low energy, are quite expensive, because at least with these guys, if nobody's using it, then somebody else can be using it. So we need to think of a way, how do we do that without the cost of that? And then we can start to make things a little bit better. And that's what I kind of work with. So the question is how to make it fit for purpose for the 1 billion people that need access to electricity. Okay, so here's a question. So we know who that is. Anybody guess who this guy is? Okay, so the question is, why Pliny the Elder? Well, okay, so who the hell is Pliny the Elder, first of all? So the interesting thing about Pliny the Elder is that he was one of the first multidisciplinary people in the world. So he is a Roman, he started off as a Roman soldier, but he actually collected a lot of stuff about what the world is, and he wrote the world's first encyclopedia on his own. So if anybody was multidisciplinary, he's the guy. So that's one of the reasons why I got him. They also have to share the same quote. But anyway, the quote comes later. So the question is, come back to say, so the question I really want to ask you is to say, how do we do a grid that's fit for purpose of 1 billion people? So the key thing is people they don't buy energy, they buy service. So the first thing is, if you're going to provide energy for new people, don't be like a white male idiot that I am and assume that everybody wants refrigeration. Go and talk to the people and find out, what do people actually want? What's the culturally appropriate way to do it? So this is exactly what we did. We started off to say, we know that people wanted lighting and mobile phones, and then we went into communities and actually asked them, what do they actually want? And we worked in groups of people, and we worked with women, a group of women, a group of elders, and a group of youth. And together, we worked in a number of different communities, and we said, okay, what do you actually want? But what we then did is we actually did so this is a qualitative piece. We then went to a quantitative piece where we gave each person counters, and they said, okay, how important is that particular service to you? So we can start to quantify what actually looking at. And then what we did is we got them to actually put them all together as a community and to talk through, do these results actually come out well? So it's a a qual process. You can see I'm not a social scientist, but anyway, working with social scientists, we then developed this method, which came out very interesting. And then what we could do is we could actually classify to say, okay, here is stuff which creates near-term economic benefit, and also it's easier to deploy, and what can we do for different things? And what we found was, we got certain things for the community, which is things like grinding machines and market centers and things like that. And then in the domestic sector, we basically wanted things like lighting, radios, mobile phone charging, incubators and stuff like that. And so what you were saying is actually there are two different types of services that people are looking for. There's stuff for the home, which actually makes their quality of life better. There's also a whole lot of stuff, especially in this sector, which is looking at improving their economic ability, their economic capacity. So we said actually what we need to do is we have stuff which makes things better for people. Then there's a whole lot of services, things like egg incubators, grinders, drills, shavers. That was the shock for me, was to say how important actually hair care products were, for the men and for the women. You can see, for me, I don't care, but for that, they're very important. Okay, so that was really useful. And so what you're saying is that how do we do it in a way that's not going to kill the planet? And so we're looking at solar PV and with batteries. And so what you're trying to do is balance what do the people want, how do we create economic benefit, and how do we not kill the planet and doing that at the same time. And the key insight that we said is that we need to move energy for social needs, so that's for the home, through both space and time, because what happens is that most of the social needs require at night time when the sun's not shining. So how do we deal with that? So the first thing we looked at was saying is, okay, if you've got lots of homes here, you can see what we do is we put a hub in the center, there all the different homes sitting there. And basically what you do is you create another hub where we put lots of energy together, which means that you can do economic activity in that local area. And here, this is what it actually looks like. This is in your area. And you can see we've got a large 3 kilowatts of solar PV in the top. We can do posho mills and other activities around there. And then what you do is we basically say we have batteries which you charge at the hub, and then people can actually walk them to the home. So that now means that we don't have a distribution system anymore. And this is the type of thing that, so the batteries are about that sort of size. That gives you lighting. And basically we can provide lighting into that. Now that's okay, except you're now going to walk the batteries backwards and forwards, and that's not always the greatest thing. So the question was, can we go for a really low cost but lossy grid? So the question is, instead of the hub, instead of walking here, could we actually connect them up together? And what we decided to do, which is something really unusual, is we went to fairly low voltage DC. So we went in plus minus 60 volts. So to put that in context, is that you can touch that. You can put your hands across it and it won't hurt you. Okay, so it's really low voltage. So that means the community can now do the install process. You're not having to get KPLC engineers out to do it. Okay, it now means that you can also, the other trick that we did was we said that we could actually use, and here's our model of this, is we're actually using steel wire, fence wire. So instead of paying something like $5 a meter, we're now paying $5 a kilometer. Okay, for this stuff. Okay, and also, who wants to steal fence wire? Whereas copper is really valuable, whereas fence wire doesn't have a huge amount of resale value. But then what we do is we put some really smart power electronics on either side to actually make the system really super smart. So this is really bizarre because here I am in an IDP community in the middle of Kenya, and actually we're going into a refugee community in northern Uganda, putting in one of the world's smartest grids ever, because we can control everything really well. But it's also really low cost because we're taking out a lot of cost in the system. So what we can do is that we can now start to say we can replicate this, so we can scale this, so we have lots of little hubs over lots of different areas, and then we can start to connect them together. Okay, so we can start to connect them so we can start to share the energy between them. And now what we can do is, instead of $800 a home, we can start to look at doing something like $200 a home, and that includes the cost for the economic activity as well. So it actually makes things even less than that. It's probably taking out about $50, which is cheaper than a solar home system. And you're getting economic activity. That's why I had my picture, because if you have a look here, you can see you have this radial event and they connected. This is a radial one, this is a radial mesh topology, but that's why I had my picture. So that tells you I'm getting close to the end. So the question is, what quote did these two share?
South Africa, no, we had some.
Close.
Oh.
So can we power Africa? It seems like an impossible task until it's done. And I hope this is something that you'll take into your field and to say, it always seems impossible until it's done. And you're the guys that are going to be doing it. Thank you very much.
Are you as pumped up as I am? It seems impossible until it's actually done. So you still have 4,165 days. You can do it. It is impossible until you get to do it. Our next speaker, before our next speaker, we'll just have a quick waking up for all of us. Somebody had offered to wake us up. It's a 2 minutes icebreaker. Oh, there you are. Come on. Come on up, come on up, come on up. Oh. Yes, it's you.
I was going to the big one.
It's not behind you. Yes. She knows herself.
Thank you. What we're going to be doing now, we just
We've been giving loads of lectures. So we've been provided with direction. So we want to make sure that our body system also tries to follow a direction so we can remain focused. So can we move our hands this way? So can we join with one of our legs? So as you're doing this, can you now continue with the hand and change the direction for the leg? So what happened?
Not coordinated.
So to solve the problem, we must remain coordinated. Thank you.
Isn't it always a treat with this one? Oh, fantastic. So as we settle down, our next speaker is an absolute close friend and a good friend of our folks as well. Professor Sandra Friedman is a professor of the laws of British Commonwealth and the USA. She's done incredible work in human rights and anti-discrimination laws, in women and the law, and it's an absolute pleasure to welcome Professor Sandy to give us her insights on how all this fits within the human rights framework. She's also the director of the Oxford Human Rights Hub, which I would encourage you all to have a look at the end of the sessions, please.
Well, thanks so much, and I hope everyone's feeling coordinated now. We've obviously had a long and quite intense session. So what I want to talk about is something quite different, which is human rights and the SDGs and how we can work together to achieve gender equality through using human rights. Now, as we know, the SDGs are extraordinarily ambitious and transformational, particularly in the goals in which they set for eliminating poverty by 2030 and empowering women and girls under SDG 5. But what, for my purposes, is the most interesting, sorry, what am I doing? Is that a little clicker? Is this a, yeah. Is this it? Sorry, top one. Sorry, Sam. Sorry, everybody. Just while we're doing that. So for my purposes, what's the most interesting about this is for the very first time, the Sustainable Development Goals make an express commitment to human rights. And particularly, it joins together human rights with gender equality. Okay. Should we go back to slideshow? So everyone else has their beautiful slides. Yeah, is it the same problem? I'm not sure I can do this. It was done yesterday, but I'm not sure. We'll start again. Meanwhile, everyone can practice the coordination. I don't know how many people managed it. I certainly didn't. Right, so back to this. So from one of the most important steps forward was to say that part of this transformational vision was to protect human rights. And exactly how they did that, though, has not been set out. So what's the open question really about the role of human rights and SDGs is how can we harness human rights to achieve the SDGs, and particularly how can we make this promise come true, that is to realize the human rights of all and to achieve gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. So what I want to do in very briefly in the 20 minutes available is to ask how this applies to one of the most pressing issues for gender equality, and that's reproductive and sexual health rights. The stark reality of this, which I imagine many people know about in this audience, is that every day 830 women die from preventable causes related to pregnancy and childbirth around the world. And this translates globally into about 303,000 women in 2015, not to mention the significant morbidity which many women suffer for the rest of their lives, as well as their children. But the distribution of this problem is very inequitable, so that it's 80 times higher in LAMEX than in higher income countries if we take the lifetime risk of dying from pregnancy and childhood related complications. And we really do need to include in this unsafe abortions. A particularly problematic area relates to adolescent girls, where this risk of dying from pregnancy and childbirth related complications is the leading cause of death, where we also have 3 million unsafe abortions among girls aged 15 to 19. So this is the stark reality. What's even more shocking is that simple, affordable solutions are possible but are not made available. So we all know, and even in the report of the SDGs in 2017, it was made clear that birth assistance are the most effective single intervention. In the high-level political forum, which is the forum in which SDGs are meant to be monitored, in 2017, it was noted that in all countries that have achieved reductions in maternal death, professionally trained midwives and others with midwifery skills have been the key to success. Actually, birth assistance are not a very expensive intervention, and yet they are not available. Only 76% of women in developing regions are given or have any access to skilled care during childbirth. So the science is clear, but implementation is the problem, and this is where we could bring human rights to bear. So some of the things that have been talked about here, where we talked about the bridges between policy making, health-related advances, and implementation, is really where human rights can come in. But as I said, the SDGs promise is still very little worked out. What is the mechanism for how we bring these two together? We know that the promises in the SDGs around this issue are very ambitious and strong. The idea, or the goal by 2030, is to reduce maternal mortality to less than 70 per 100,000 live births. This is under SDG 3 for good health and well-being. There is also a promise to ensure universal access to sexual and reproductive health care across the whole world. This is complemented by SDG 5, which is about gender equality, which also says that the goal by 2030 is to ensure universal access to sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights. So those are the promises. We're already in 2018. We haven't got that many years before we get to 2030, and there is still a very long way to go. So if we want to reduce the global maternal mortality rate to less than 70 per 100,000, we have to go down from 2016 per 100,000, which means that we have to reduce the MMR by 7.3% annually, and this is more than 3 times the rate that was achieved under the Millennium Development Goals. And the Millennium Development Goals kind of cheated a little bit, because although they were agreed in 2000, they used the baseline data from 1990. So the 1990 baseline to 2015 was not a huge improvement. As far as universal access to sexual and reproductive healthcare services goes, there are still 225 million women in the developing world with an unmet need for modern contraception. So we have a long way to go, and we need to ask then, can we harness human rights internationally, regionally, and nationally to achieve gender equality? So to take a step back for a moment and ask, what are the differences between development goals and human rights? Well, there are many, but just to highlight some of the important ones which we need to think about if they're going to work together, is that the SDGs, first of all, focus on aggregate outcomes. So when they say, well, we want to achieve universal enrollment in primary education by a certain date, and they achieve 90%, that's meant to be a success. So as long as there's a 90% aggregate outcome, that's good enough. Also, the goals simply set goals. They don't really say very much about means. And if you look at all the many indicators that are set out, they are simply monitoring. They're not saying, how do we get there? They're just telling us what to measure. And most importantly, they are political commitments. They are not legally binding, they're not binding. And we know from the Millennium Development Goals that political will waxes and wanes. And although there was this huge outpouring of energy in 2015, when the 2030 agenda was agreed, this is not necessarily to be sustained. Human rights differ in that human rights are not interested so much in aggregate outcomes as every individual. So to come back to the example of education under the Millennium Development Goals, although they achieved whatever proportion of, in terms of addressing universal enrollment in schools, there were still 55 million children out of school. And all of those 55 million have had their individual rights breached. So the point about human rights is that every individual matters. For in the context that we're talking about now, every maternal death in childbirth matters. The second thing about human rights is that how we achieve it is as important as the ends. And we can't achieve it by breaching human rights along the way, but also human rights give you means to achieve those ends. And finally, and perhaps the most important, is human rights are legally binding. They are legally binding in that they set up accountability mechanisms for states. Now, this is something we can talk about more in discussion, because probably the main impetus for putting human rights into the SDGs was in order to improve the accountability mechanisms under the SDGs. And so a big disappointment has really been that the only real accountability mechanisms are under the SDGs are for states to voluntarily submit their reports. And I think you asked the question about what are the national action plans of individual countries and what are they doing about it. Well, it's really up to them entirely what they do about it. There has been voluntary submission of their reports to the high-level political forum, but it's what the states say they're doing. We're not totally sure they are doing what they say they do. So one of the key ways in which we can harness human rights is to try and bring accountability mechanisms to the SDGs. On the other hand, the issue of maternal mortality is probably not as simple as I originally set it out to be, in the sense that we saw with the Millennium Development Goals that similar targets were set and there was a woeful lack of success in achieving them. And this is partly because we have to understand maternal mortality and lack of access to reproductive health in terms of the broader question of gender equality, and particularly that the obstacles to gender equality are deep-seated in many social mechanisms. So why are we not providing these apparently easy, affordable ways of averting maternal mortality in childbirth? Really requires us to look behind what is driving this. And so in the work that I do, I work on women and particularly on equality. And I think in order to achieve gender equality, you have to look at it in a multi-dimensional way. And I've tended to distill this into 4 dimensions, which all need to work together if we are really going to get there, to get to these ambitious goals. So the first is to actually look to see what is the disadvantage that we are addressing. And again, from a development perspective, this might seem obvious. From an equality perspective, often it's said, well, everyone's treated the same, women are equal before the law, that's enough. Well, it clearly isn't, particularly in relation to reproductive health. So we have to focus interventions on on a proper understanding of what the disadvantage is. But that's not enough. Clearly, and very important to all of this, are the ways in which gender stereotypes work. Women are stereotyped as primarily taking care of children, domestic work, as primarily responsible for reproduction in society. And that leads to a whole range of ways in which pregnancy-related complications are given such low priority. Women are stereotyped, they are stigmatized, they're subject to prejudice, and even part of all of this are the extreme levels of violence against women, which often lead to rape, to unwanted pregnancies, and so on. Thirdly, and something which is often forgotten, is women have to be part of the decision making. Women have to participate. And finally, we need to look at what are the underlying structures which continue to drive this problem. So how does this relate to reproductive health and sexual rights? So I've put it in this wheel in order to show that all of these things work together. We might think we are redressing disadvantage, but do it by increasing the stereotyping and stigma of women, and that's not going to achieve what we want. So for example, redressing disadvantage, we might include skilled birth attendance. That is the key, providing skilled birth attendance, but also importantly to back this up with emergency obstetrics. But that isn't on its own sufficient, because if we provide skilled birth attendance, but we don't watch what effect this has on women in terms of the way in which women are treated, we're also not going to make progress. There is increasing evidence now of obstetric violence, which is at the actual moment of childbirth, but behind this we really do need to address gendered stereotypes which put women in the position in which they are, particularly the imbalance of power within the family, the lack of access of women to decision-making power, which brings us to the third bit, which is how extremely important it is to bring women into the decision-making. I think Paul Hunt gave the example of we might have facilities for women to give birth, but if women don't consent to be part of that, that's not compliant with their human rights. There's a good example from the Roma community in Europe. A lot of Roma women, when they go into hospital to give birth, are subject to really quite serious and degrading treatment in hospital. Also, they fear forced sterilization, and there is a history of that in Europe for Roma women. So providing birth facilities is not really going to deal with pregnancy-related morbidity and mortality. So we have to get women's voice in it. Behind that, and this is where it relates to access to contraception and reproductive rights, women should have the right to decide the number of children they have, and there should not be a need for authorization from parents or partners for whatever reproductive mechanisms women choose to have. And then the structural issues are the really crucial ones, and perhaps the hardest one to deal with, which is to address power imbalances in the family and society, to change sex education, provide sexual education in schools, which include both boys and girls, to bring boys and men into the issue of reproductive health, to give everyone access to modern contraception and safe abortion. And these are only some examples of the way this needs to work, and it all needs to work together. So how have the SDGs addressed this? Well, I think very disappointingly, there was so much work done around the way in which gender equality and reproductive rights go together in the run-up to the SDGs, and particularly in trying to situate maternal mortality and reproductive justice in gender equality and in power. So the SDG indicators are very thin. They just talk about maternal mortality and the availability of skilled birth assistance, which is exactly what was in the Millennium Development Goals predecessors. They don't ask for monitoring of emergency obstetric services. They don't monitor obstetric violence. There is no mention of women's consent or participation. Although the underlying gender inequality is addressed in the broader SDG 5, this is not really brought together with these indicators. So that brings me then to the human rights mechanism. And there isn't really time to talk about the accountability structures and how we actually use these structures. But what I would like to do in the time available is just talk about what are the substantive obligations. And it's worth mentioning, and that's why there's this map here, which does have the UK in the right place, I see. This is the map showing how many countries in the world have signed and ratified the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW. But I don't know how many of you even know about it. So although countries have signed up to it, many countries still don't take their obligations under this convention as seriously as they should. And yet, as far as reproductive rights are concerned, there is really a lot of substance there that we can work on in order to bring the SDG goals to reality. So I've divided it up into the 4 headings of redressing disadvantage, etc., to show what substantive obligations countries around the world have already signed up to, and it's really then up to us, if we're going to make the promises of the SDGs come true, to insist on them, and we can talk later about how we do that. So the most important thing is that Article 12 of CEDAW requires states to ensure access to healthcare services, including those related to family planning, and to ensure to women appropriate services in connection with pregnancy, confinement, and the postnatal period. And this is augmented in later comments, etc., both under CEDAW and a related convention, the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, where they do mention emergency obstetric services, which are left out of the SDGs. Not only is it mentioned, but it's put in the context of a violation of human rights, a violation of the right to life, and even more so, cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, which is the equivalent of torture. So emergency obstetric care services really need to be in there amongst what's being monitored for the SDGs. Importantly also, the CEDAW, and I should mention that the African Protocol on Women also has quite a lot of these substantive rights, which also need to be brought to bear to this issue. But what the CEDAW does is it recognizes that it's not enough just to have those services there on paper. They have to be affordable. Women have to be able to access them. They have to be free when necessary. And also we have to go back and not just deal with the crisis. As you said, the woman who walks in the door, it's not enough at that moment. It has to go right back to adequate nutrition all the way through pregnancy. And then again, all of these sexual and reproductive health services need to be available to all, either at no cost or to provide support for those who can't afford it. So really quite extensive addressing of the barriers for women. As far as addressing stigma, stereotypes and violence, the CEDAW also gives us quite a lot of material to go forward with as a legally binding obligation. And perhaps the most far-reaching of the CEDAW articles is Article 5, which requires a proper understanding of maternity as a social function and the recognition of the common responsibility of men and women in the upbringing and development of their children. So it really does require us to address these background gendered stereotypes that put women into certain roles around reproduction, make us understand that this is a social role and something to be shared between men and women. I've obviously jinxed. There we go. Thank you. And also, most recently, the International Convention on Economic and Social Culture Rights brings together the access to reproductive rights with gender-based violence. Gender-based violence which can deny women full sexual and reproductive health, and there are SDG indicators about FGM, child marriage, etc. So all of that can be brought together as a legally binding right. The third thing is about voice and participation. And this too is something, as I said, which is in the African Women's Protocol, which is about decision about freely deciding the number and spacing of children, information, education, and means to enable them to exercise these rights. Under the general recommendation, it also makes the point which I made before, which is there should not need to be the authorization of husbands, partners, parents, or even health authorities in women's choice as to the way in which they can have space their children, have access to abortion, have access to contraception, etc. And finally, so far as structural change is concerned, the CEDAW goes far in understanding, making us make commitments to protecting women at work from dismissal on grounds of pregnancy, so that you can combine work and paid work in the workforce, unpaid work in the home, shared parenting, provision of supporting social services to enable both parents to combine family obligations and work, and crucially, access to comprehensive sexuality education. So these are the ways in which CEDAW gives us legally binding provision towards achieving the SDG goals. We need to work together. We need some concerted effort on many fronts. It's really not enough for us to say, when we get to 2028, we didn't get there. It's up to us to make use of these mechanisms to accelerate the achievement of these goals. So I think there's a lot of energy in the SDGs. There are all these goals where the world has committed to, but there's much too little attention to the qualitative dimensions of achieving it. And because there is too little attention to that, it's not as likely as it should be that these goals will be achieved. And most importantly, we need to be holding states to account for the promises that they made. This we can do through the human rights, through the substantive human rights mechanisms which are already there, as well as recognizing that regardless of the SDGs, these were binding commitments which had been made a long time ago, and need to be given a lot more attention. Probably then, in the end, although I've talked about them being legally binding, that they are international commitments, many of you will say, well, even in international arena, an internationally binding commitment requires something more. It requires political will, but political will requires collective action on the ground. And that's where everybody here and everybody around us needs to play a part. So we need to mobilize all the avenues, SDG monitoring, human rights, collective action at all levels. And ultimately, we can see that the SDGs, and I think this is a quote from Winker and Williams, where they say, because the world has adopted the SDGs, they offer our best contemporary global opportunities, and that's where we need to situate, as human rights advocates, the use of social rights. And I think, and I wanted to close with this, which comes actually from the motivation for the African Women's Protocol. We have to remember that women's rights are not gifts from government. Reproductive rights are human rights. My body, my choice. Thank you.
Wow, fantastic. Please, let's give another round of applause to Sandy. I think it will do us some good to use the accountability of human rights as a way to, make all the other goals that you're all working towards a lot more feasible and probably a lot more enforceable. So thank you so much for that, and also for highlighting the importance of working within other disciplines, including the social sciences, to be able to make our work go a little bit further. So our next speaker really does not need any introduction. She is a program manager at the African Academy of Sciences, working on the affiliates program as well as other postdoctoral programs in the academy. She is a well-known consultant working in climate change, health, vector-borne diseases, and so forth. And so it gives me great pleasure to welcome my colleague, Judy Omumbo, aka Patricia Espinosa.
Well, colleagues, it was a great struggle this morning to realize that I must relinquish my role as the Secretary General. I heard the sounds of the coup outside from the representative from China with her slogan of "You must keep coordinated." So I do understand the great difficulty sometimes our heads of state have with leaving power. But since I shall not follow that example this morning, I'm going to return to my life in a real community and be a citizen of this world, and indeed a citizen of Africa. So this morning, I'm going to talk to you about the historic climate agreement, the historic Paris Agreement on climate change. And I'd like to encourage you, as really colleagues in science, to think, where is it you fit in with your research work? Given all that we've heard about global agreements, a little bit about climate, human rights, and so on and so forth. How does this affect you? I'm not sure why this is not showing the first slide. Is that the first slide? Anyway, I'll just talk to it. In 2015, was a very significant year for Africa and indeed for the climate talks. Two very important international or global agreements were ratified and signed up to. I'd like to talk first about the climate agreement. The climate agreement is sort of an agreement that has been agreed upon by many, many countries across the world, to combat the impacts of climate change, really to understand what it is that's coming towards us. What do we expect in the century going ahead? And a collective agreement between different countries, across the world, to start to think about what we need to do to mitigate the impacts and also to adapt to the sort of impacts that are up ahead. Now, the agreement is agreed to keep global temperatures this century to below 2 degrees centigrade, and where possible, to have additional efforts to keep the global temperatures, the temperature rise rate below 1.5 degrees centigrade. There's also a commitment to implement measures on a global level to ensure that this happens, and also a commitment to increase global financing for climate change to about $100 billion by the year 2020. There we go. So I'd like us to have a look at a few maps. I'm quite interested in maps. I've done quite a lot of work on mapping, and I find that they're very good tools to use to visualize things. Now first, this is the first map about the countries that have signed up, signatories to the Global Climate Agreement. And what you'll notice is that there's, in Europe, many countries have signed up, but I'd like to just focus on Africa. Many countries in Africa have remained silent. Now, it was very interesting, what do we call it, the exercise that we did with Grace yesterday, that you find that the countries that are sitting on the floor are the countries that are actually silent on that map, the ones that are still marked in orange. And that is very representative of where we are. When you don't have the resources, you also don't have the voice. And there's a tendency for us to sit on the floor. I've been to many of these COP meetings, a few of the COP meetings, the Conference of Parties, and the roundtable discussions will happen with Europe sitting around the round table, America when they feel like it, and basically Africa, the countries in Asia that were mentioned who were sitting on the floor yesterday, do not sit in the front rows, or they're not included in the closed discussions that happen at the end where the decisions are made. Now, in 2015, that was pretty much the case. And it's good for us to look at the reasons why. Why is it that we are sitting on the floor, while the other countries who have flowers and sweets and cakes are sitting at the table and wearing the suits and making the decisions? Okay. I was very interested also in the same representative from China who's staging the coup against me, when she said that we often, in order to get resources, we cry extra more, you know? We really cry really hard. It's, I have nothing, so you give me more. Now, I think we, as scientists in Africa, we have a position to now change that narrative. Let's work on changing that narrative. Another very interesting set of maps are called these density equalizing cartographs, which are used a lot by UNDP. UNDP likes them because they really make people look at the map and start thinking, oh, you know, you always look at where you come from. So I'm trusting that we are from Africa, so you're looking at Africa. This is a representation of the global distribution of GDP, okay? So as you can see, there are some countries that are chubby, and then there's some nations, Africa particularly, is really skinny. Okay, it's not 100% true, because you know there are different pockets of Africa that are a lot wealthier than others. But this map sort of represents many things: equality, human rights, women's rights, access to education, aside from wealth, health, you know, the prevalence of infectious diseases, and so on and so forth. Now, is it true that Africa is always skinny for the good things and as fat as possible for the bad things? And where is our role in also changing that narrative? You know, I'm sure that there must be some truth. These are based on data. But do remember also that these data are not generated in Africa. We are scientists here. We're not generating our own data. Okay? These maps are very important because they also give that image about Africa that we're still the crying continent. I look around this room, again, I look around this room. I do not see Africans who are crying. Again, I'd like to just say, we need to change the narrative on that. On the other hand, this is a look of what the impacts, the global impacts on health that climate change are reported to going to bring to us. This is another cartograph which says that the regions of Africa are likely to suffer more from infectious diseases, the increase of infectious diseases. This is a combination of what's going to happen with the population. We were told that in the next couple of decades, 20% of the world's population will be Africans. So hey, looks like we'll be the next China. So how we take advantage of that position of being the next China is really important, and it's upon us to plan for that. There is quite a lot of truth on the inequality of the impacts of climate change, how these impacts are going to affect Africa disproportionately compared to the rest of the world. Professor McCulloch, I'm really very interested to see this is related to your talk, and we never had a discussion beforehand about what we're talking about. But yes, there are aspects where Africa also needs to actively participate in planning what is going on, what we're going to do about all our climate sensitive sectors to make us in a position where we can move up that y-axis and be in the quadrangle where we're looking at the world to go to. And it's very important to link that to what we're going to be talking about in the next few minutes. The Sustainable Development Goals, a set of 17 goals with 169 very detailed targets. And Tolu, you're right, if nothing was left out, 169 detailed targets agreed to by nearly all of the world's nations on the 25th of September, 2015. This is another thing like the climate agreement where I'm not sure that we can really say Africa sat around the table to talk about SDGs that are our issue. Now, I'm not complaining, I'm just raising a fact that as scientists, we have not made ourselves present in these discussions, and it's time that we did. We're talking about our SDGs. Really, that's what the SDGs are for. If you look at them, it's about hunger and agriculture and lack of energy, and as you saw from the lights, the places that don't have energy are actually in Africa, and so on and so forth. We must sit around the table with these agendas. The interesting thing about the SDGs is they're really interconnected. You can draw one of those orange lines, squiggle from any box to the next. They're very much integrated. And then one thing that really connects us as a planet and as a continent is our environment and our climate. Now, we always feel that there's a tendency in Africa, we always feel that this discussion about climate has to be from somebody else, and we'll keep silent on the discussion because we don't produce the greenhouse gases, and so on and so forth. But if you also look, the SDGs, you see their images there, which have a cloud and the sunshine, that's representing climate. All of those are SDGs that are very, very closely related to the climate and the environment. Now, there are global indicators that there are changes in climate, and just to look at a few facts, this shows the global indicators of land-ocean temperature over the years. You can see that there's an overall trend of temperature increase across the world. If you look at it in sort of decades, there are times when the temperature has been going down, there are times when it's going up, there's times when there's more variability, less variability, but overall, the globe is actually warming. It is actually warming. This is not a joke, colleagues. This is not a joke. It's a serious matter. Similarly, let's come a little closer to Africa. This is rainfall patterns over the Sahel. The Sahel was not always a desert in the way that it is, but things are changing. rainfall is also decreasing massively. I lived for a few years in Oxford. I was very lucky to have schooled here a little bit. And I remember summertime being 2 days of warm weather. 2 days of warm weather. But now it's not like that anymore. This is hot. I woke up this morning, went for my run, and couldn't stop sweating, and I almost forgot where I was when I came out of the shower as I reached out for my bikini. So things are changing. The world is changing in terms of climate. Come a little bit closer even to in Kenya. This is the highlands of Kenya. You can see me working there, talking to some tea pickers. And they're talking to me really about how even the climate of Kericho has changed a lot. This is Kericho in Kenya. And I did a small study just looking at the data, because there's been a lot of controversy over has the temperature increased in the highlands, has it not, is it a matter of data, and so on and so forth. So we did look a little bit more. Oh, I've lost it. Let me try and find it. It's not there. I don't know what happens between where you email. Anyway, I did a study in this area to look at the data on temperature, and we found that within the highlands, just in Kericho, over a few decades, the temperature has actually already been increasing by 0.2 degrees centigrade. Now, even in that small area, at 0.2 degrees centigrade a decade, we'll be reaching those targets of 1.5 degrees centigrade and 2 degrees centigrade very soon. Another thing that the UDP has done quite a lot of work on is looking at agricultural production, GDP, and trends in rainfall. These are trends in rainfall compared with GDP in Malawi and quite dramatically in Ethiopia. I think many of you have seen this map quite a lot, to show how rainfall patterns really mirror GDP growth. Now that makes sense, of course, because Africa is very, very dependent on GDP is very much dependent on agriculture across the continent. So rainfall and changes in rainfall for Africa are really important. So what has Africa's policy response been? Several different declarations more closer on the continent, on the environment and on health. Ministers have ratified this. Presidents across the country have sat in meetings and agreed that indeed we need to do something about it. And Africa, the African Climate Policy Center with the Africa Union, have set up different policies to look at climate change and understand what's going on. So there is a lot of support on the continent on the policy level. However, there's still a gap. And there's still a lot of work to be done to say, how are these policies going to be implemented? And I'd just like to talk you through where as scientists we could fit in to address some of these things. And in general, in the areas where we work now, as serious leaders in science, we should be thinking at the level of policy. When you're doing your own research work, how is it going to change the lives of the people who live in the continent? I think somebody alluded to this yesterday. It might be very interesting for you to produce clean water, but on a general scale, how is this going to change the lives of more than your research group or your village, but rather the continent in general? So my discussion is going to, my talk is going to focus a lot on the socio-economic benefits, the socio-economic changes in the world, in Africa. There are gaps that have been recognized by the African Climate Policy Center, and indeed they've set up a climate research for development initiative that is looking at research priorities for research in Africa. The Climate Research for Development is the acronym is CR4D, And these are the policy areas that they have prioritized for Africa. There are gaps in the foundational science, the understanding of climate science. The gaps are such that even for the global climate models that are developed, there are no data. There's just no data from Africa. And I'll look into why. There's not much information on impacts, particularly in the sectors that are always referred to as the climate sensitive sectors, include agriculture, water, health, disaster risk reduction, and energy. Energy is a very, very key sector for Africa. And then the very big gap with policy. I think we're always very nervous to work with our policymakers in Africa because there aren't that many channels, and you have to be a politician. But I think that's another agenda that we change. We need to change that narrative. Africa needs to have scientists in policy. Now, when we're talking about gaps in data, I'd like you to just have a look at this map. It shows the global distribution of observation stations. These are just weather stations that look at rainfall levels, temperature levels, calculate evapotranspiration, all these sorts of basic data that are collected to look at climate and to look at weather patterns and so on across the world. So you can see the blue ones, the colors represent the percentage reporting from these data stations. And what you see is that in northern countries, they're all blue, so 90 to 100% of their weather stations are existing and they're currently reporting data to global sources. Whereas in Africa, we have very, very many silent stations, which do not report at all. The stations are there, but there are no data reported, the red ones. And then the rest tend to be the yellow and green, where it's 50% or less reporting. Now this is a massive, it's a tragedy really that we're not collecting the information. We will not know. So many of our climate programs are just traveling blind. We're running blind, we don't have the information because we're not collecting it. It wasn't always like that. This graph shows you that for the different parameters in rain over the years, what has happened in the reporting rates. And you can see that in the 1980s, many of these observation stations stopped reporting data. So what's happened to them? They're out there, but our governments haven't been funding the reporting of climate information. So I think there's something that we can advocate for over there. It's very difficult to predict the future, particularly for socioeconomic issues. It's really hard to know what's going to happen on the large thing, but I think on the large scale. But I think it's important to think about what is the future going to be like, given the different scenarios. And we had a great exercise yesterday looking at that. I think it was quite fun. It was quite fun to see the blue tarp going over everybody. But there are some realities that we are thinking about there. It might not cover the whole world, but there are islands that are sinking. There are islands that are actually getting submerged in water. And there are other impacts that are going to affect us as Africans in the socio-economic realm. So I'd like to talk about ways in which we can discuss how we can discuss the predictions of the future. Now, the climate change research community has adopted a new consensus frameworks how to look at look at some of these scenarios. They're called the socio-economic shared socio-economic pathways. Okay, that's for my tribe. That's a very difficult sentence to say, but I think I passed. Shared socio-economic pathways, the SSPs. So if you look along the x-axis, this looks at increasing, in that direction, you look at increasing challenges to adaptation. So I think our countries in Africa would be along that axis. With climate change, there'll be more challenges to our ability to adapt to climate change. And if we look at only adaptation, it's going to be harder and harder as things get worse and worse. On the y-axis, these are increasing challenges to mitigation. Mitigation sounds a little bit more like prevention, cutting down on greenhouse emissions and so on. As things get, as climate change worsens, there will be greater challenges to mitigation. In the socioeconomic sense, we want to try and maintain a sustainable environment. So whatever actions you put in, you need it to keep you in the bottom left-hand corner from your side. Okay? So these frameworks are very useful frameworks for people in different sectors to sit and discuss what you think needs to be put in place given different scenarios of climate change. If I have a discussion looking at the health sector, which I'm from, along the sustainability pathway that we looked at, number 1, which is the bottom left-hand corner, SSP1, a gradual but dramatic global shift toward a more sustainable pathway is what it represents. There's more inclusive development that respects perceived environmental boundaries. So you can just have a look at the bullet points to look at what we expect. If we have a sustainable pathway, lives will be much better for people. Health will be a lot better. Life expectancies will increase because the environment is conducive, agricultural systems are working well, our nutrition is working well. I think this is the ideal along that kind of social, so that SSP. And of course, the burdens of disease are falling down because all regions of the country are playing their roles the way you want it to be in a sustainable world. The middle of the road is sort of a little bit of adaptation and mitigation, but not much. And again, there's some inequality because the population is growing. All of these factors are making it's getting just a little bit worse over time, but things have been slowed down a bit because of adaptation and mitigation efforts. You can use these scenarios whether you're working in the fields of engineering, disaster reduction, sorry, I didn't mean engineering, energy development, and so on. Now, on the other extreme, when the world is so divided in the direction that we are going so far, that countries are fighting over property, they're fighting over land, they're fighting over resources, there's regional rivalry. That's the other scenario where adaptation has failed, mitigation has failed. So that's the other extreme. With inequality, there's been some efforts for Africa to adapt, but the richer countries are still producing fossil fuels and so on, burning fossil fuels and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of inequality. Again. And then the other scenario, the fossil fuel development is continuing along the pathline that is continuing. Then the other countries, again, in Professor's presentation, there's a real imbalance. So basically what these scenarios, and I'll go back to the actual picture, what these scenarios indicate is that even as Africa, we have a role both in mitigation and in adaptation, okay? We can't just sit back and say we don't produce the fossil fuels, so there's nothing for us to do. There are things that Africa does need to do. We need to understand our climate, and this is actually an opportunity for us to start from the beginning. We haven't got the fossil fuel problem. So how as a continent can we develop clean energy resources, use water healthily, look at human rights and so on and so forth, to make sure that we're not traveling along the same path that other countries have followed. So that's really more of my take-home message for you. At the Academy, we have climate change is one of our strategic focus areas. And we've had our flagship program called Circle, which I'm sure you're all aware of, was a climate-related program. Actually a training opportunity for postdoctoral researchers to look at climate and do some climate science research in these areas. So we have about 100 graduates from this program who have done the postdoc, and they're out there willing to sit at those tables and understand those negotiations. So this is an area that we would like to build up. And related to that is policy and governance. As I mentioned earlier, we are not sitting around the table at the discussions. So even in your research work, I'd like to encourage you to just think about in your research area, where is the climate? What are the questions that you're addressing? And if any of you do not fit under any of these topics that have been raised as global issues that need to be addressed in society, then you can come and ask me. I'll tell you exactly where you fit. There's population and human resources. There's economic development. There's human development. There's technology. Technology is a new field for Africa where we have a lot of potential to grow, to invent. We can still invent cheaper options for things that have been created in other areas. A lot of the technology is not accessible to us because it's unaffordable. So can we look at making things affordable for us on our continent? Lifestyles, your diet, obesity. We need to all run like Tolu. You know, Africa is known for our good runners and our good football players. This is a massive export. We export athletes to France and so on and so forth. Our environment, our natural resources, and policies and institutions. So colleagues, where in this does your research work fit? Are you looking at that big picture? The word big picture is such a cliche, but is your research addressing the big picture for Africa? And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Judy. I mean, that just made me feel really short that I had to bring it all the way down. You know, the struggle is real, Tolu. The struggle is real. So thank you so much. A very big round of applause for all our speakers from this morning. You've given us so much to think about, so much to take home, a lot. I hope we will be talking about these things in the next few days while we're together, and of course even afterwards. So I'm going to invite us all for coffee, and please let's try and make it 15 minutes so we can come back for the moderated sessions where all your questions, all your concerns will be aired. And in the meantime, if you have any things that are not going to be addressed in the process, please use the sticky notes, put them on the wall, then we'll collect them and have a quick discussion at the end of the day. All right? Enjoy the coffee. We're putting to these slides. I just want one more slide. Can I put the transfer something? Sorry, I put the transfer something in. It's the slide with the kind of strategic. Well, we have space for this, so this is what stays on the screen. Yeah, but I want to use that to start this session. Okay. Okay.
There it is. There it is. You see that when you sit down.
I'm going to ask Total.
You've been shortlisted.
Yes. It is.
This is about the Bodleian Library, so it's about the Western Library. And
Yes. I'm going to grab a coffee.
This is the thing where work is inside of this exhibition. It's a 15th or 16th century wine. So I can give this to you. That would be reminder.
So they can
No.
share this one.
Expensive because but look at this book. This book is just to die for. So she is the first one, in Dutch painting, they always throw in a beetle or a grasshopper or something. She actually was the first in 1717. She's the first one, for example, China. She's the first one to put the boats on the river. She traveled from Holland to Suriname in the northern part of South America with her daughter when she was 51. And it was there that she began to really look very carefully at etymology and about metamorphosis. And she's the first one to paint metamorphosis.
It was popular already.
And she's really weird.
That's actually been doing for that.
Well, she was moved into a family of painters. From a very young age, she was recognized for her talent. So she was painting, but she had a particular interest. She had a particular interest in insects. And when I think of this spider on the left and this one spider, the couple's name is okay, so this is where she went to Suriname. Which is just in here. I think it's this image the original is in the culture, because her work is now all over the world. Some of it's online, some of it is interactions in also the Getty culture. The Getty group, and you see she was into cabinets of curiosities. She did inventions lessons. So she made a microscope. No, it's a magnifying glass. Well, that one is a microscope, but this is a magnifying glass. And she was interested in
I have to, if I can't see you, what can I give it? Do you know them? Do you know Unfriendly? I'll prepare it to you. And then, wait. But definitely Unfriendly. But I will see. Since it's not here, and it's interesting about this one. All right, that's very nice. Thank you so much.
Let's take that night.
So, when getting easy, decided to Hi. You need to meet her. She's a fantastic anthropologist.
I just received a gift.
Oh.
Yeah, very nice.
I'll come.
Thank you so much. We'll talk later.
Yes, I am. You know how? Well, that means okay. Yes. Okay, very good. I used to live in Cape Town. Spent 5 years there. Okay, let's hope for you. Okay. I'm at Oxford. I'm doing a master's in education, international comparative education. Yeah, so it's my second master's. I've been here for about 10 months. My first one was African studies. Yeah.
How are you
How are
today?
you then? Great.
I didn't wear a jacket today. I couldn't. I was so hot yesterday. I thought I was going to collapse.
Yeah, you're right. I just came to put it on the tie. For the sake of it, I brought it, so I have to. I hate wearing a coat and tie, believe you me. This is like once in a blue moon, or once in a red moon, as you call it.
We've just had one.
Yes, yeah, I saw it. It was in Africa as well.
Yeah. It was also in Southeast Asia, not so good, but certainly in Egypt there were some remarkable photographs.
Yes, even East Africa, there is very remarkable.
Yeah.
Especially Kenya, kind of resolved the
across, you can hear me? Great. So I don't know about you, but I really, really enjoyed this morning. It was like, I actually want to hold the mic for the whole session and ask my own questions, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to allow our speakers and to tell us a bit more based on your questions. So I'm going to be fair. I'm going to share the questions with you. There are a couple of mics running. We have one mic here. But before we start, I really wanted to say this when he was here. Sir Charles had to go. It's not often you get to say that as an African. But actually, although in Kenya we do have a Sir Charles, one of the former Attorney Generals. But we have a very able representative who's going to address and take many of the questions around food security. And this is Professor Chris Weber. Many of you were told to see him at tea break. And he's an emeritus professor of plant science here at St. John's, and has worked around the globe talking about food security and thinking about plant science. So I really want to welcome him to this panel, and the rest of them you know and you've heard about. I'm still smarting that Tolu had a picture of some of us running. I'm not sure I signed any consent on it. But the fact is, this morning was really quite fascinating in that all the talks here kind of represented what the academy is about. The interdisciplinary, I can never say that word, interdisciplinarity of the academy. Yesterday someone asked the question on, do we only just deal with what science is and not the social sciences? The academy is about all knowledge, because it's all knowledge that is going to enable us to address the questions that we need to address to ensure that we reach and achieve the SDGs. Oh, my slide was taken down and asked for a slide that should stay up there. But it's fine. But the point that was made this morning, Tony talks about the fact that the transition of her own career has been really thinking about the science that she did, the epidemiology, and how to make an impact. Looking at urban health, looking at housing. In Kenya, many of you have heard about the Big Four. My biggest story about the Big Four agenda is that we're still going to work in silos. So we're looking at housing in terms of adding numbers of houses in Kenya. But we haven't talked about the fact that housing has to basically give basic shelter to ensure that health outcomes are reached. Those types of linkages we need to address, and the great talks that we had this morning were really great. Sandy talked about human rights and the SDGs. And I'm a bit afraid after what happened yesterday to really mention the fact that in Africa, many of our leaders are trying very hard to achieve the SDGs, but they're not addressing it in a way that is protecting human rights. So I'm just asking this question, and please don't hang me, but is a great president like Kagame in Rwanda, he's doing the right thing in terms of the SDGs, but there are very many issues around human rights, for example, that need to be addressed. Otherwise, many of the girls and many of the people who should be getting the benefits of achieving the SDGs may not achieve. Judy talked about climate change. When I met Judy, I was a little girl a long time ago, almost 20 years ago. Judy was mainly doing malaria research in a malaria research institute, is what we were in Kenya at the time, or in Kenya at the time. But she's thought about climate change for so long and thought about the health impact. When I left research, I'm not an active researcher anymore, I was thinking about malnutrition and how all the gains that have been made in terms of malnutrition are going to be reversed by climate change if we don't address them. We heard about that this morning from Charles. He did say that we are not going to be able to sustain what we've done in terms of food nutrition if we don't actually start addressing the climate change. I felt there was a bit of tension between Malcolm and Charles this morning, because Charles talked about the fact that emissions in Africa, we shouldn't worry about them. We really need to spend our emissions to get to where we're going. But actually what Malcolm was saying was, and I know many of us have heard the term leapfrogging. Africa needs to leapfrog. We need to embrace technology to ensure that we're not building grid systems that were good enough 20 years ago in a resource-rich environment. We actually need to embrace technology to make things cheaper, and we don't have to actually use the emissions. Judy brought that point out. Clean energy, as Africa, we should actually be leading in that research, because we need to actually keep our, I want to live in a nice climate that doesn't have smoke. We don't have to create that smoke in Africa, but we can address some of the needs that we want. Sandy brought out issues that are really close to my heart. Over the weekend, I was talking to 17 to 24-year-olds from the globe. Youth who are thinking about science and thinking about things that they need to do. But one thing that none of us did here for your next panelists, I would like to see someone talking about education. But Prof. Abakas brought it out yesterday. We are massifying education. The quality of that education is a huge concern. We're not going to leapfrog if the quality that we're providing in terms of education is just providing basic education that doesn't create a skilled environment, okay, a skilled workforce. So the fact is, 15-year-olds in Africa, 40% of them cannot address any questions mathematically, 40% of them have a very low background in science, and 40% of them have a very poor background in engineering. So how do we achieve that? How do we achieve all the topics that have been brought forth here today if what we're giving them in terms of education is actually poor quality education? These are the issues that we have to think about. And the right around $1 cents, our youth bulk, it has to be a dividend, but how do we turn it into a dividend if we're not giving them the right tools? Educated girls stay, they have less children, they get married later, so they're not going to die of the mortality issues that we heard this morning. We need to educate them. We need to ensure that gender equity is what we're trying to provide. So all our research really needs to have a gender lens. If you create toilets and they're not being used by women, then 50% of our toilets are actually useless, right? So there's no point of actually implementing new things if new things are not going to be used by most of the society. So with that, those are my personal reflections of what I heard this morning. I'm gonna ask the panelists to think about the education element and to address it at the end. But at this point, I'm going to open it up to everyone in the audience to ask questions to the panelists. The challenge here is that I'm only gonna allow you to give or ask a question that is as long as 15 words, all right? So I'm gonna count. So when you get to 15 words, I'm gonna stop you and I'll ask the person who
have a bell.
to answer. So basically what I'm trying to say here is keep your questions short and keep them concise. And like me, I have 10 questions for each panelist here, but let's give everyone a chance to answer the question. Yes, and we can...
So very quickly, I retired 11 years ago and I got involved in something called biosciences for farming in Africa. There's a World Wide Web, b4fa.org, you can all look at it. There's a newswire every week and so on. Since then I've been teaching in West and East Africa on food security and sustainability and things like that. I think something very relevant to all these very excellent talks today is, there's the saying I always have at the beginning of my lectures, particularly in Africa when I'm working with journalists and scientists from Africa, he who has food has many problems. He without food only has one. The other one that I picked up today is that we in the so-called developed world are going to have to shrink and share, and I very much believe in that. I think education is very important. If you think about agriculture in Africa, which is probably one of the most important things, and most of the African governments have not signed up to the Maputo Declaration of spending 10% on agriculture of their GDP, they're spending 2, 3, 4%. Some countries are worse than others. 70% of the smallholder farmers in Africa that feed Africa are women. I don't need to say anymore.
So I'll take the first question.
This question is directed to Malcolm. I want to really understand the SDG number 7, universal access to all. You can count it 100 times as well. Universal access to all. The 2030 timeline, is that realistic? Because in somebody says 2080 is the right time to actually, because even by 2030 you're still going to have 600 million people without electricity. So I'm concerned about the grandness of this goal.
Right, so the question is, can we reach it by 2030? How fast, look how fast mobile phone technology spread over Africa. In 1980s, some of you were born in 1980s, you would have thought that mobile phones in Africa would never happen. I now get better coverage in the middle of Uganda than I do here in Oxford. It's ridiculous. I think we're at a tipping point where it's going to be commercially viable to do stuff at scale. My gentle challenge to myself is I've got 15 years left until I retire. By the time I retire, I would like every person in Africa to have access to electricity. I think it's doable. I think we might even be ahead of time. That's why I use that quote. It seems impossible now until it's done.
Yeah, but I think I disagree.
So we will take some more reflections on that, but the point here is, and I totally agree with Malcolm, is if we start thinking about leapfrogging, it might be possible, but the fact is if we limit ourselves to what we think can be done right now, we're not going to achieve it in the time that is given.
Prof. Tolu, my question is for you. You spoke about intersectoral thinkers. How can higher education prepare graduates to become those intersectoral thinkers?
That's an excellent question. I think it speaks to the point that Evelyn raised earlier. How little focus we have in general around critical thinking as a core part of basic education. How when we think about science and the way it's taught, pretty much until you get to postgraduate higher education, we think about science and we taught science as the knowledge we know. And it only really gets interesting when you start realizing science is about what we don't know. So how can we start thinking about teaching science? You know, the number of planets I learned at school is completely inaccurate now. You know, and the number of continents I learned is inaccurate. But we just teach knowledge and facts that we learn that we know the more that we do science are going to be inaccurate.